My name is Emily Tector. I'm the project coordinator for the Situating Science project. It's a national project. But first I wanted to say a quick words about our thanks to various people who would be able to make this happen, this special talk. Cindy Patton herself, who gave this talk at UBC and is now here at the University of Saskatchewan. So thank you very much for coming out to this. And this is part of the Lives of Evidence National Lecture Series. This particular talk is also supported by the Canada Research Chair in History of Medicine, Department of History, Evidence for Democracy Group for getting the word out, and Situating Science. So Situating Science is a national networking and partnership building project, a strategic knowledge cluster funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We promote communication and collaboration among humanists and social scientists that are engaged in the study of science and technology. We network and seek and strengthen partnerships across the country and internationally. We're in our final year, but working on further funding and partnership opportunities. We have dozens of videos, podcasts, blogs, hundreds of events available on our website and YouTube channel, so check those out. And we are joined by other folks virtually online tonight via live stream, so hello to you too. This event, the press release, Inventing the Crystal Meth-HIV Connection, is part one of the Lives of Evidence National Lecture Series, which examines the cultural, ethical, political, and scientific role of evidence in our world. We'll have renowned bioethicist Carl Elliott speak on the psychiatric research abuse, in Halifax, February 28th. The co-founder of Evidence for Democracy, Scott Finley, speaking on accountability and the future of Canadian science, there, March 5th, followed by philosopher Jim Brown on privatization, patents, and progress, March 20th. The Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Science, Stathisilos, will speak on scientific evidence in Ottawa, April 10th, then Toronto, April 16th. Most of these events will be streamed live, so you can watch from your home if you can't make it out and fly out there yourself. So check that out as well. See our website and social media for details and updates. Now, without further ado, here is Erica Dix. She is the Canada Research Chair in History of Medicine here at the University of Saskatchewan, and she will introduce our speaker tonight. Oh, sorry.
No problem. So I'm Catherine Zwicker, and I'm a Situating Science postdoc here. Eric and I are both pleased to welcome Dr. Cindy Patton to the U of S today as our guest speaker. She's visiting us from Simon Fraser University, where she's been appointed in a few different departments since 1999, and she's just finished up a Canada Research Chair. Just finished up or finishing this May? Just finished up a Canada Research Chair in Community, Culture, and Health. Dr. Patton has a very diverse academic background. She began by doing a BA in Anthropology and Economics, then followed that with a Master's in Theological Studies and Women's Studies, and finally a PhD in Communications, which she completed at the University of Massachusetts in the early 90s. Since then, she's pursued an extremely active research program encompassing gender studies, media studies, and the social study of medicine and health. She's authored numerous books or edited collections in all of these areas. Her most recent work is a collection titled Rebirth of the Clinic, Places and Agents in Contemporary Healthcare. Now, Dr. Patton's interests in health extend beyond the page or the classroom, as she's a devoted community health activist. For instance, as the director of Simon Fraser's Health Research and Methods training facility, she helps to train students and faculty in community-based research methods for health promotion and the evaluation of health programs and delivery of care. Her talk today, which is titled The Press and the Press Release, Inventing the Crystal Meth-HIV Connection, draws on her expertise in media studies and one of her main interests in the study of health, which is the social aspects of AIDS. So I want to thank Dr. Patton for joining us here today, especially since she's braving what is our coldest month in Saskatoon, quite a difference for a Vancouverite, I think. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. This thing's a little bit awkward. Okay, I've got to switch to these glasses. Now I can't really see you, but I can see my notes. So once I'm done talking, I'll switch back. This is a paper or a project that I started in 2005 when the episode I'm going to talk about was unfolding. And I originally wrote it for a very different kind of project. There is some sociological theory that I left in here that I think will be of interest to some of you who I understand may be captive sociology students, perhaps being held here against your will. So hopefully that'll be entertaining. When my colleague at UBC asked me if I could put something together for this series, I was, I'll just note for your benefit, lying on a chair in the Caribbean at that moment. I said, oh, I've got this paper. When I went back and looked at it, I wanted to make quite a few revisions to it. So I've kind of brought it into the context of considering evidence, how evidence is invented, debunked, and then not actually taken out of public circulation. The sources that I'm working from, I've read a lot of the material, but the sources that I'm working from in this kind of tightly structured description are something which I call the press releases, what I call the specialty media, and then mainstream media. The press releases generally would have come from a publisher. They're sometimes coming from the scientists themselves, and they're circulated to some list that they have saying, hey, I've got this new article coming out, or I've made this discovery. The specialty newsletters you may not be familiar with. In the 1990s, when desktop publishing became very popular and accessible and cheap, quite a few people, usually with PhDs in a science, began publishing little newsletters that were aimed at very specialized audiences. So there would be like the journal of, or the newsletter of hematology technicians, the newsletter of dental hygienists. So they're people who have some kind of medical training, but not sort of high-level medical training. So they're a kind of translational tool. So these are it's the flow between the press releases and these specialty journals, and then the pickup from the specialty journals to the mass media that I'm going to be talking about here. There are obviously a lot of other interlocking sources of information. When I presented this Monday at UBC, one of the graduate students said, yeah, it's like a vortex. And that's a really good description. There's a sort of vortex of pieces of information floating around that come together at different points to form something that's perceived to be a fact. Okay, I'm going to start, though, with two of the articles in the mainstream media about crystal meth and HIV. The first is from Newsweek, February 28th, 2005. And the author writes, in LA, activists handed out buttons that declared Dump Tina, one of meth's many nicknames. But the entreaties fell on deaf ears, ears deafened by meth's siren call. At this spring's annual Black Party in Manhattan, one of the big bacchanals on the gay party circuit, volunteers from Gay Men's Health Crisis handed out condoms to a crowd shaken by recent reports that a meth user had contracted what might be a new super-virulent strain of HIV. Not 10 feet away, two revelers high on crystal were having unprotected anal sex. And then from the Houston Chronicle, June 21st, 2005. Methamphetamine crystals glisten with the beauty of a starry night. Each tiny star is filled with the promise of euphoria. Each carries with it the threat of a night of devastation so dark that many who yield to its temptations never return. Now, this 2005 coverage of the evils of crystal methamphetamine recall a longer history of reefer madness, angel dust psychosis, crack tweaking, and cocaine delirium. The crystal story indeed shares many narrative elements in common with these earlier drug hysterias, including, first, that the drug is returned in a more dangerous form. The Milwaukee Sentinel reporter says, the crystal meth now in the market is more powerful than its antecedent versions that were popular with the West Coast outlaw motorcycle gangs in the 1970s. Second, that this drug is worse than any previous drug. And the Newsweek author says, all the social and environmental issues surrounding this drug affect society more than any of the other drugs. Third, that the drug appeals to a specific sector of society. The New York Times says, experts fear that more and more people, particularly gay men, are relying on the stimulating effects of this drug. And finally, again from the Milwaukee Sentinel Journal, that the drug is so dangerous that people are no longer compos mentis. In effect, they're barely persons at all. And the Journal Sentinel writer says, in short order, users are rendered into broken and phantom versions of their former selves. Rotten teeth, a wasted face, paranoid delusions. Now, it's tempting to analyze this story according to the well-worn formula of moral panic theory, which rests on an Althusserian understanding of the interests and actions of the state, with its state apparatus or police, and its ideologic state apparatus or schools, families, religion, media, etc. And moral panic theory combines this framework with a kind of Freudo-Marxian understanding of social psychology. Stanley Cohen, who coined the phrase in 1972's work, has been usefully transformed to analyze race, youth, and policing by Stuart Hall in the 1970s, Paul Gilroy in the 1980s. It was modified by Gail Rubin to analyze sex panics in the mid-1980s, and it was foundational for the style of AIDS media studies that was inaugurated by Simon Watney in the mid-1980s. I'm going to talk a little bit about moral panic theory. Moral panic theory posits a society that's more or less in stasis until an underlying economic or environmental upheaval disequilibrates it, at which point social groups that have been cooperative become potentially hostile. Pervasive structural inequalities that had been in a tentative balance are re-equilibrated by pitting one group against another, specifically by using fear to ignite volatile intergroup conflicts, which are called panics, which then justify direct policing by the state. Through a process of displacement and substitution, marginal persons or subcultural groups become scapegoats who deserve and require policing. Now, by the new millennium, so much of life seemed to be regulated through quasi-medical ideas and personnel that moral panic theory seemed to me less and less useful in explaining how something like ideological power might be deployed in service of something like a state. Biomedical personnel participate in a relatively independent status hierarchy in which prestige is not so much associated with money as it is with excellence, defined within competitions for funding, publications, and awards, all of which are adjudicated by scientific peers. Biomedical enterprises like laboratories, university departments, etc., are also tightly connected to supranational entities like pharmaceutical companies and things like global health organizations. It seems wrong to subsume all of this under the term ideologic state apparatus, since science as an enterprise functions both at a higher administrative level than the state and partially independently of the reward system controlled by any particular state, although there's considerable cross-national variability in that state scientific reward structure. After 9/11 and the emergence of a coherent rhetoric of terrorism, more and more official speech seemed to come in the form of reassurances, as if we're all already at the top of our panic state and we just can't take anymore. This official style of calmness, this cool calculation, is often linked to what many people call neoliberalism, with its apparently objective but not compassionless description of who will die and when, presented as a mathematical rather than a moral formulation. Whatever dramatic flourishes it retains, mainstream coverage of biomedical events, even those linked with long-standing red-button topics like sex and drugs, ultimately proceed through calming. In the case of the Crystal superbug story of 2005, which I'll get to in a second, there was indeed considerable flourish in lurid prose, but these do not seem to have been in service of scaring us, but rather of reassuring us that there are already other people, doctors, rehab personnel, and social workers, who are taking care of these matters for us. Now, we might have to lower our expectations about getting rid of problems. We might have to learn to live with rather than cure addiction or disease. But this is not the logical trajectory as described in moral panic theory. This is neoliberal culture's version of a house of horror tours, complete with drug zombies, exploding labs, and unstoppable viruses, until we're handed a map for how to get ourselves safely back home. If there's a psychology here, it's voyeurism and not panic. Okay, I want to go back now to that 4-month gap between the two quotes with which I opened this talk. The main difference, despite the Houston Chronicle's more dazzling prose, is the presence in the February 2005 Newsweek story of an alleged HIV superbug supposedly circulating among gay men in New York, and the absence in the Chronicle in the story in June, which in the longer text reviews the data on gay men and meth at length, and to its credit, explores meth use outside of the gay community. The changes that happen and don't happen in this 4-month gap are crucial to understanding how a Crystal gay HIV connection became nationally publicized through the New York HIV superbug story, even though both scientists and health educators criticized the science and politics of that story within days, even before the Newsweek article went to press. In fact, the gay community itself employed the moral panic theory in their critique of the public health authorities, an attack that primarily served to enhance their own stature as gay sensitive social psychologists, as experts on the social sources of gay men's drug use. Since it was supposedly these experts that the media cited on the role of homophobia in gay men's use of the drug. The main result of the new facts was to reorient the concern with gay men's mental health to combating crystal meth alone as a sexual risk factor, ignoring the fact that crystal research and the reporting on it shared a homophobic assumption that gay men cannot make rational decisions about sex even under the best of circumstances. Now, before I go any further, I want to lay out the timeline of the press releases about articles, conferences, and interventions that were, in a greater or lesser part, the impetus for the various mainstream articles on gay men and crystal meth. If I were a better artist, I would use a complex systems kind of map to show this dovetailing of press releases and their uptake in the specialty newsletters, and then the transfer of this to the mainstream media. It's not possible to draw a straight line, but I can give you a very strong impression of how the information moved through these various sources of publicizing this information. What I would visually represent for you is what I am attempting to argue, that if these scientific facts get established in both the public mind and then reciprocally in researchers' conceptual frameworks through a complex relay between different sites of scientific publicity and social impressions, a process Ludwig Fleck captured in his 1935 The Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, to which I'm obviously and deeply indebted. Okay, so here's the basic timeline of the press releases in the crystal meth HIV story. So I'm going to go through these, and then I'm going to read to you excerpts from some of the mainstream articles in that February to June gap between when the superbug story was first announced, debunked, and then became kind of the crystal gay story continued on even without the superbug component. Okay, July 2002, there's a press release in which the Centers for Disease Control in the US announces an increase in the use of Viagra and other party drugs among men coming for STD testing. This is based on 3 months of preliminary data from a clinic in San Francisco. This particular story was not widely reported in the mainstream press, and it was only picked up a little bit in the specialty press, but significantly by a little newsletter called AIDS Weekly, which picked up the story in July 2002, and another one called TB and Outbreaks Weekly, also in July 2002. And then there's, really nothing much happening in the crystal meth press release world. On March 2nd, 2004, there's a press release for an article by Dr. Antonio Urbina, who's alive and well and still commenting on HIV-related things in New York. So I think he did a bad thing in this case, but I don't want to completely disparage the man. So there's a press release for an article by Dr. Antonio Urbina, which was published in the March 15 issue of Clinical Infectious Diseases. His article is entitled Crystal Methamphetamine, Its Analogs in HIV Infection, Medical and Psychiatric Aspects of a New Epidemic. However, the press release glossed this rather long title with a shorter phrase, Crystal methamphetamine use increases HIV risk. This was picked up by 8 specialty newsletters, and there were some small articles in several major newspapers. I'll discuss the article itself later, but I want to note at this point that despite the article's title and the press release's gloss, it is not a piece of original research, but rather a literature review. Okay, March 9th, 2004, the Centers for Disease Control announces its National STD Prevention Conference will include papers on crystal meth and HIV. This is like the come on to register for the conference. That's the sort of status of this release. The 3 papers it announces are in fact 3 papers from the study group about which it reported in 2002. So the 2002 kind of 3 months of pilot data, which is really like a natural history study, just looking at these guys coming in the clinic. Those become the 3 papers announced as the first item for this conference. August 9th, 2004, the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York issues a press release from its crystal methamphetamine task force, which has met a mere 3 times, and it announces that crystal is a, quote, clear and present danger for gay men. This text is picked up in 9 specialty newsletters, which basically say Gay Men's Health Crisis says it's clear and present danger. I'll just make a note here. I can tell that I was looking at the specialty newsletters. I can tell that these were press releases because they're identical. So essentially, they get the press release and they republish the press release. So any of you who are doing research, you should just kind of twig to that. If you keep reading a story that's identical, it very well may have come from a press release. Okay, then the big event. February 11th, 2005. The New York City Department of Health reports on a man said to have progressed rapidly from HIV infection to AIDS-defining symptoms. He is said to have a, quote, highly virulent and drug-resistant strain. Now, scientists were intrigued in cases like this because they were among the first people who were recognized to have been infected by an already resistant strain. Up until this point in time, in the early 2000s, it wasn't clear whether you got this little hunk of junk called HIV, and it started doing its thing, and then it became resistant while it was in your body. This began to be evidence that, in fact, those resistant hunks could go, and other people could be infected with already resistant strains. So this is why the scientists were extremely interested in this guy. However, the public health people sort of get quite alarmed, and the mainstream newspapers start talking about this as a superbug. Significantly, the New York City Health Department report, which is on the web, that was its venue, provides a number of commentators for reporters or whoever is interested to follow up on. And our dear friend, Dr. Urbina, is one of those commentators, despite the fact that he's conducted no original research on the topic. So the announcements spawn superbug headlines in the New York papers and around the country, and this becomes the most widely circulated HIV superbug party drug story. One of the major speculations is that crystal meth alters brain biology to loosen inhibitions, and that it allows HIV to infect cells more effectively somehow or other. Other people began arguing that there's a direct interaction between the superbug and the crystal meth, such that AIDS progression speeds up. Others argue that the debilitated state of meth users who, I read you what the mainstream press was saying, they're these like completely devastated people, that it's their debilitated state which makes them less able to fight off the opportunistic infections you might have. Scientists outside of New York who had been working in these areas were largely skeptical. They had seen these kinds of rapid progressions before, and there were a wide variety of reasons for them. The local AIDS organizations in New York believed that HIV and crystal were parallel problems, a la the Gay Men's Health Crisis Project, but they didn't necessarily see them as related in any specific way. Okay, so that was February 11th. There's this, week and a half brouhaha. Scientists are saying, this is idiotic. The people in New York are digging their heels in. It happens that the Conference on Retroviruses and HIV, which is the big conference for people in that subspecialty, was about to happen. And Dr. David Ho, who was in 1996 Time Magazine's Man of the Year for his AIDS research, got permission from his research group who was looking at that case to present what then became called the New York case at this conference. And he was basically, had skin ripped off of him. The other scientists were just, going at him, questioning every aspect of the case. Okay, April 2005. There's a press release announcing the first national conference on methamphetamine, HIV, and hepatitis, which was in part funded by the American Foundation for AIDS Research. June 2005, the so-called New York case is published in The Lancet, again with a press release. And this time the story is picked up by 18 specialty newsletters and results in the largest flurry of press reportage on the follow-up, despite the fact that, as I've just been describing, the science of that case had been contested by virtually everybody, and so it was sort of, kind of hard to understand why these months later, this story kind of got a new jump start. Okay, August 2005 was the first national conference on methamphetamines, HIV, and hepatitis. It was held in Salt Lake City, again announced with press releases. The conference became controversial because of the overlap between the war on drugs related previous conferences on methamphetamine from 1997 forward, and because of the supposed harm reduction agenda of this particular conference. And then the last press release of interest to me, again, a small press release not widely picked up, is announced an ethics journal of the American Medical Association article on the New York Public Health Commissioner's decision to announce the superbug case. The author sort of goes through all the typical bioethics categories and essentially exonerates the public health commissioner for his announcement and criticizes only the style in which he announced the case. She suggests at the end of her article that harms that may have accrued to the gay community should be considered and mitigated in the future. Okay, now the superbug story. The idea of an HIV superbug didn't need crystal meth, since gay sex was already constructed in the media as promiscuous and largely unsafe. But as we saw in the chronology, the gay men crystal meth researchers benefited quite a lot from the superbug story and the publicity that it brought to this connection. And they benefited even though there was really no new research in 2005. Everything that had been figured out had already been figured out. Or the fact that you weren't going to be able to figure out much had already been kind of ascertained. Despite the complaints of gay organizations who were employing a moral panic critique, the superbug scare then mainly put an exclamation point on the sex-drug connection and reinforced this topic and, of course, the importance of the researchers who were investigating it. Before the superbug story, the mainstream media articles about crystal appeared in relationship to the press releases from medical journals or conferences. After the superbug story, there emerged something like a meth beat. since the entrance of policymakers and public health officials meant that the story would have ongoing developments and there would be a kind of pleasing arc. There were these people you could keep calling up and saying, what's happening on the crystal meth front? So the stories were no longer cribbed from the press releases, but elaborated upon, even though the reporters didn't look very far afield for their experts. Even the debunking story was more the result of an intra-scientific debate than it was a piece of investigative journalism. Mostly what happened was regional papers grafted local comments onto what were supposed and represented as national studies that had been published or presented at some point in this couple of year period of time. But these so-called national studies were really just studies from individual research groups situated in other cities. Even the local information that they grafted onto these supposed national studies wasn't really local information. The municipal health authorities and the regional experts that were cited relied on their data, relied on the CDC to provide their data. But it's important to note that these kind of middle-level medical scientific professionals were just the people at whom the specialty newsletters were aimed. And so it's very likely that most of the regional experts had already been seeing these press releases over the previous couple of years. So this news story kind of, I think, consolidated for them the idea that, yeah, this thing is really happening. The local angle to the stories also required explaining how crystal meth got here, which relied almost exclusively on the pre-existing idea about how AIDS got here. That is, that gay men are highly mobile inaugurators of regional epidemics. This doubled the problem. Since gay men and HIV were so tightly associated, and there was no plausible relationship between the HIV-saturated gay party circuits and the redneck crystal epidemic, or the epidemic said to exist among dying young men, then very little attention was paid to these other two groups. So whether or not crystal was an actual problem in any given locale yet, it was produced as something that could be a problem, and that this problem would somehow involve gay men and AIDS. It was therefore imperative for readers of both the popular press and the specialized media to get the facts about crystal, sex, and HIV. Almost overnight, study committees, curriculum, and outreach programs were created to deal with the crystal, gay sex, and HIV problem. Now, I said almost overnight because there was no sudden awakening to the idea that there might be health effects to crystal meth use. In fact, the US federal government had already allocated considerable funding for law enforcement solutions to methamphetamine, a drug that had been targeted for special attention by Janet Reno, who launched a new phase of the Reagan-Bush war on drugs with her methamphetamine interagency task force, authorized and funded through the Comprehensive Methamphetamine Control Act of 1996. Their first, and by invitation-only, conference was held in May 1997 in Omaha, Nebraska, at a Red Line hotel. I don't think that was very much fun. It followed the previous year's methamphetamine conference that had been held by the Drug Enforcement Agency, which, having already identified a substantial redneck connection, was already working with Walmart to monitor the sales of cold medications that are the primary ingredient for meth manufacture. If you came to the 2005 story, however, you would have had no idea that there was a previous identification of another crystal meth epidemic, and that one had been more closely tied with direct policing and drug cartels and this kind of thing. Okay, by the time of the crystal story, most readers were probably skeptical about killer drug stories. And so really it was a superbug angle that made the story kind of become so prominent. Even the New York Times' excellent AIDS beat medical writer, veteran Lawrence Altman, who's been writing about AIDS from virtually the beginning of the epidemic, even Altman was not initially skeptical about the superbug meth connection. But this is in part because he didn't seem to see the story as first and foremost a scientific story, but rather a social story. And in his article he says, health officials have long said the drug's stimulating effect and erasure of inhibitions contributes to sex marathons that have increased the spread of HIV. That's the February 12th, 2005 article, the day after the New York Department of Public Health announcement. He would have gotten the story like a couple of days before that. Despite questions about the accuracy of the story within days of its publication, only the superbug aspect of the story was ever retracted. The claimed connection between drugs and run-of-the-mill HIV remained. Several reporters covered this debacle, including the New York Times and the LA Times. And Altman writes his own kind of story was a bit wrong. These analyses of the superbug story, though, focus on the uncertainty of science, not on the poverty of science reporting. So here's Altman's, one of the two stories he wrote, kind of taking back his original, there's a superbug story. Altman says, at one level, the reaction illustrates the intense competition among scientists and their institutions to communicate new findings and get credit, crucial in obtaining money to expand their research. As a result, some scientists said the appearance of a possible drug-resistant and virulent strain of the virus in one 46-year-old man meant little. The man's immune system might have been compromised by the crystal methamphetamine he had taken, they said, or the virus could have rapidly led to full-blown AIDS for other reasons that needed additional investigation before the public was alerted. The LA Times was a little bit harsher. They were quite a bit farther away. And they say, some AIDS specialists now say the New York announcement was scientifically naive and needlessly alarmist, risking the effectiveness of future prevention campaigns. Many experienced AIDS workers have seen these conditions. None are particularly new. Then they quote their local expert, Dr. Douglas Richmond, who's the director of the Center for AIDS Research at UC San Diego, who says, there is known resistance to 3 classes of AIDS drugs. This is relatively common. Then, quote, rapid progression occurs in a subset of people, said Richmond, lead author of a study that showed widespread drug resistance similar to that of the New York patients. Quote from Richmond, high rates of promiscuity among men who have sex with men, especially those who abuse methamphetamines, is frighteningly high. The first statement about rapid progression is well within Richmond's ambit of expertise. But the relationship between sex and drugs is not, as we can easily guess for ourselves if we simply consider that neither promiscuity nor abuse are social scientific research concepts, but rather morally laden ones with very little definitional specificity. Indeed, the superbug episode was defined as a question of scientific facts in relationship to HIV strains and resistance. There was no discussion of whether the easy association of sex, drugs, and disease is a sound premise for HIV epidemiology. Only Kay Wright, who was covering the coverage for the Columbia Review of Journalism, actually went and looked at the existing data on HIV rates and that on the distribution of crystal use. And she shows that the new infection rates that were being kind of hyped at the time were actually greater among young black males, while the crystal meth use was faddish among white gay partygoers. But even she doesn't raise what I call the denominator question. Any infection rate is generated by dividing new infections by the presumed number of people who are at risk. In this case, gay men at risk for HIV. But the men who were in their teenage years and the early 20s, teenage years and early 20s in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when this infection rate, which triggered such alarm, was calculated, were the men of the millennial generation, a baby boom larger even than the more famous baby boom, who were themselves the first generation to contract HIV. If researchers did not consider the birth rate of their cohorts, and I find nothing in the reports to suggest that they've done this, then they were dividing their millennials by too low a denominator. That is, the idea that there was a sharp increase in new infection rates among younger men in this time period may, in part, be a math error. Now, reporters had a vague sense that there was something a bit amiss about this story, and that in the absence of the superbug, they needed to establish the sex-drug infection causal relationship. So they turned to a new group of experts, those in the field of sex and drug use behavior. That is, they turned to social scientists rather than biomedical researchers and epidemiologists. But what they failed to consider here is that the rules of evidence and the process through which knowledge is produced, critiqued, and expanded is rather different in the social sciences than in the biomedical sciences. No one expects universal truths from social science. Indeed, the hallmark of good social science is the ability to juxtapose universality and particularity by working across studies that have used different methodologies aimed at different levels of society. Savvy AIDS Beat Science reporters have an assessment of which biomedical scientists are credible and which aren't. And they have a good idea of which discoveries make sense within a gambit of scientific progress and which are out of the blue, and thus less likely to reflect good research practice. Lawrence Allman should have been one of those reporters, and he wasn't. And so he makes up for his lack of acumen about the sex-drug aspect of the story by focusing his investigation only on the politics of the scientists who were insisting on the veracity of the superbug. Virtually all of the other reporters drop the science scandal and instead pursue that drug, sex, HIV connection as if this were the same kind of science and scientific critique. This, of course, landed the reporters, mostly less seasoned than Dr. Altman, in the domain of health promotion politics. So, a little bit alarmed, they turned to what must have seemed like solid ground, the science of the Crystal HIV connection. So in the context of a failing science story, and with no clear repertorial standards for selecting among social scientific findings, the follow-up story became overly influenced by that 2004 literature review by Dr. Urbina. And even more importantly, by the fact that Urbina had been cited as the guy who knew about this by the New York City Department of Public Health. So what's actually in the article, which at least one mainstream newspaper views as proving the Crystal HIV increased connection? And actually, when I had a little break earlier, I just did a little quickie search. And even as late as 2011, people are still citing this as the first article that proves this connection. As I've already mentioned, the 2004 article is not original research. At best, it's a sketchy review of several literatures: neurobiology, drug treatment, medical complications, and what he calls epidemiology, a section in which they conflate clinical epidemiology, or the study of disease presentation, with social epidemiology, or the study of the so-called social determinants of disease patterns. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with reviewing literature, but this particular article does not conform to what were already the accepted standards for analyzing existing research, that is, a Cochrane or a Cochrane-style review. We can see from the article's publication history, which they list, when the article finally comes out, that it took about 18 months for the article to be submitted, reviewed, revised, and finally published. And I'm actually kind of surprised it was published at all. But certainly the reporters who went back to that article, either by contacting Urbina for fresh quotes or relying on the article as a state-of-the-art piece, seem not to have understood how medical academic publishing and literature reviewing work. Here's a fresh quote that the New York Times, not Altman, another Times writer, got on February 22nd, 2005. Urbina says, "Lowered inhibitions combined with the drug's tendency to dry out mucosal membranes and cause abrasions in the mouth and rectum might slightly increase a person's vulnerability to infection," said Dr. Antonio Urbina, the lead author of a study on crystal meth and HIV that appeared last year in the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases. Okay, that's the newspaper of record in the United States. Now, those of you who have followed HIV writing and the media analysis of HIV writing will realize that Urbina has almost perfectly recycled in speculative terms what Paula Treichler in 1987 described as the fragile anus stereotype about gay male sex. Okay, I'll give you just a quick idea of what's actually in the review article. Some of it's extremely good research. There's work on crystal from addictions researchers. A lot of it's animal model studies. There are a few articles on gay men and crystal use, which are largely taken from these kind of ongoing surveys of people who are coming into a clinic for usually STD care. There's some research which has more recently been disputed on cardiac problems and crystal methamphetamine. Again, it's a clinical observational study, so it has that problem of you're only looking at the people who were sick and came in here to get help. There's some extremely speculative work on primate brain physiology. And then there's work on dementia in people with HIV. Now, the problem is Urbina basically takes a kind of flying leap and connects the like primate brain physiology work and the dementia among people with AIDS work, which are not comparably structured studies, and there's really no relationship between the two. Missing from the article entirely is any of the social science research on drug use and gay party culture, especially the long-standing research, probably 2-decade-old research at that point, coming from the AIDS Behavioral Research Unit of New South Wales in Australia and AIDS Committee of Toronto under the leadership of Barry Adam, who's at Windsor, both of which basically documented over time that drug use and sex are extremely complex. Gay men and gay male culture are continually adapting to new party drugs, including the development of both safe sex strategies, so-called positional risk reduction, or being on the bottom if you're positive already, being on the top, sort of sorting things out based on this. Serosorting, which means I'm going to only have sex with someone who has the same serostatus as I do, as well as avoiding anal sex altogether. And also developing drug harm mitigation strategies. If anyone was at a bar, if anyone was at the Saint in the late 80s, there was tons and tons of water and fresh fruit available for people who were doing the party drugs then. So there are all these kind of cultural mechanisms for kind of working out how to make the drug use you have chosen to engage in more healthy or less harmful. Now, in fact, ACT had contested the crystal sex HIV connection in 2005 based on their own research. But they were really widely attacked both by public health and by other groups within the gay community. And they eventually backed down and said, well, okay, there's a drug problem. But they would never say this is a worse drug problem. They wouldn't go with these kind of other more alarmist approaches to understanding that connection. Okay, so the Urbina article has this kind of mishmash of science, none of the social science. And so really the article has very little coherent evidence for any form of meth, sex, HIV connection. And the article reads kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, one of those really, really hard ones, where the pieces seem like they could go in a whole bunch of different places, and you can't tell until you get to the very end whether it's in the right place or the wrong place. Despite failing to identify a mechanism between a mutant strain of HIV that interacts biologically with crystal meth, there remained an assumption in the media that crystal meth simply drives gay men to risky sex that they might not otherwise have had, thereby increasing HIV rates. Although I suppose plausible in theory, and certainly this was supported by the anecdotes which the reporters dutifully collected, there was no solid evidence that crystal meth users were actually becoming infected at higher rates, nor that they had significantly more unprotected sex than they had before they started using crystal meth. All the data showed was that a greater percentage of newly infected persons were using crystal meth now that crystal meth had become popular. The possibility that you could take drugs and reduce risk was never seriously entertained. And even more embarrassingly, contra the much-touted hypervirility invoked by those descriptions of sex marathons, very few reporters tumbled to the reality that excessive crystal use, in fact, causes impotence, a state colloquially known among gay men as crystal dick. Thus, erotically ignited men might throw themselves onto the bottom, placing themselves at risk from any less impaired men who might be HIV positive. But from a mathematical point of view, that reduces by at least half the number of potential carriers in those dramatized scenarios. Viagra came on the market in 1998 and was almost immediately, as you saw from the CDC press release, it was almost immediately a black market drug to be used in combination with other recreational drugs, most of which cause erectile dysfunction. So some party drug manufacturers began to mix Viagra into their drugs. But there seemed to be an interaction between some of the protease inhibitors that were coming on the market to treat HIV and Viagra. And so HIV positive men were urged to be cautious with their Viagra, and they were. This is the kind of health education work that was going on all along underneath the radar as the Crystal sex HIV story surfaced in the mainstream media. So the problem with the discredited superbug story is that the discrediting didn't go far enough. Even the efforts to be non-homophobic rendered gay men as hapless sex addicts, always on the verge of being overtaken by a drug. Gay psychologists and doctors, Urbina and many, many others who became experts, did little to challenge the sex-drug connection. Their solution was 12-step groups and therapy to help gay men seek what one of them called meaningful relationships. Perhaps worst of all, gay men themselves believed that they, or if not me, then those who I might have sex with, are addiction-prone, drug-crazed men. Lost is the reality that gay men have always developed sexual health strategies with whatever information they could piece together. You or I might disapprove of some of those strategies, but until we're willing to police pregnancy and STDs among heterosexuals, then we need to examine our disapproval for the traces of homophobia that it might contain.